One ship, three countries, and a chain of events so insane that even today, people struggle to believe it actually happened. The HMS Agincourt, the only one of its kind in history, 7 main battery turrets, an absolute world record that remains unbroken to this day. And yet, almost no one knows about it. Why? Because the true story of this ship is hidden behind technical tables and dry dates. But beneath them lies a tale that would make anyone's jaw drop. Churchill, Brazilian Dreadnoughts, Turkish village women, British bayonets on the gangway, and one botanist with orchids who, without knowing it, rewrote the history of the First World War. Watch this video to the end. I promise this story will not disappoint you. So, let's begin. May 31st, 1916. The North Sea, about 6 in the evening. The sky is thick with gunpowder smoke. On the horizon, more than 200 ships. The British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet are clashing in the largest naval battle in human history. And suddenly, a flash. Not just a flash, something so intense that several British ships send the same radio message. One of their own has just blown up. Officers grab their binoculars. The smoke clears slowly. The ship is still there. It's intact. It just fired. All guns at once. 14 guns. 7 turrets. 1 broadside. The flash was so powerful that it was mistaken for a ship's magazine exploding. The observers couldn't compose themselves for several minutes. It's no wonder. Such a ship never existed before or since. 7 main battery turrets is an absolute record in the history of warship construction. A record that still stands today. But here's the strange part. This ship, the most heavily armed participant in the largest sea battle in history, did almost nothing in that engagement. The enemy received mere scratches. The ship itself suffered no damage at all. Because its history is not a story of great victories. It is a story of 3 countries that wanted to own it. And none of them got what they wanted. In its lifetime, this ship bore 3 names and 3 flags. It was ordered by one country, bought by another, and seized by a third. 3 names: Rio de Janeiro, Sultan Osman I, and Agincourt. In this story, there is a botanist who smuggled seeds in a basket of orchids, and with that alone, collapsed the economy of an entire country. There are 250 lashes that triggered a chain of events that changed the balance of power in World War I. There are Turkish peasant women who shaved their heads to sell their hair and raise money for this ship. They gave every last coin. The ship never reached them. And there is a letter. Churchill wrote it to the king 3 days before the Turkish crew was supposed to hoist their flag on this ship. In that letter, the ship is already called by its English name. To understand how all this became possible, we need to leave the North Sea and travel 10 years before Jutland, to the other hemisphere, to a country that, at the beginning of the 20th century, suddenly found itself with massive wealth and decided to spend it on becoming a great naval power. The beginning of the 20th century. Brazil is experiencing what would later be called its golden age. Imagine, one country controls almost the entire world market for rubber. The very rubber used to make tires for cars, soles for shoes, and gaskets for pipes. The global industry is growing. Factories are running non-stop, and every one of them needs rubber. And rubber is only in Brazil. Furthermore, Brazil supplies more than half of all the coffee consumed by humanity. Money is flowing into the country like a river, and the question arises, where to invest it? The Brazilian military had the answer ready. In South America, a local arms race was underway. Argentina and Chile had already managed to acquire navies powerful enough for their region. Brazil was lagging behind in this competition. Now, with money in hand, it was their time. Initially, they decided to order 3 ironclads from Britain, the most formidable warships of that era, and a whole flotilla of smaller vessels. The contracts were almost ready. And then, this happened. In February 1906, the British Navy launched a ship called the Dreadnought. This ship carried 10 main-caliber guns and reached a speed unattainable for any ironclad of that time. In one day, it made every existing war fleet on the planet obsolete. Absolutely all of them, including the ironclads Brazil was just about to order. The Brazilians didn't panic. They simply changed the order. In August 1907, a contract was placed for 3 dreadnoughts. 2 of them, the Minas Gerais and the São Paulo, were built almost simultaneously at the shipyards of 2 leading British companies, Armstrong and Vickers. Each carried 12 305mm guns in 6 turrets. And here is a point worth realizing. In 1907, only Britain and the United States possessed dreadnoughts. Not Germany, not Russia, not France, not yet. But Brazil had already ordered them. A country perceived in Europe as distant exotica suddenly joined the ranks of world leaders in the class of warships. It's no surprise that London grew nervous. Rumors crept through the British press. What if these ships end up in Germany or Japan? The newspapers hyped the topic more and more. The House of Commons became truly agitated, and the question arose seriously: is it worth giving these ships to Brazil at all? The Brazilian government provided assurances, wrote official letters, and explained. The situation was calmed down with difficulty, but it was calmed. Both ships were completed and handed over to Brazil in 1910. Meanwhile, a third one, the Rio de Janeiro, had already been laid down. In Brazil, they celebrated. Admirals posed for photos on the decks. Newspapers wrote about a new naval power. But here's the interesting thing. While all this was happening, in a London botanical garden, seeds had been lying for several years. Small, unremarkable seeds of a tropical tree. And they were already doing their job. Slowly, imperceptibly, but quite inevitably, destroying everything Brazil had just built. But before we get to those seeds, we need to talk about the people. About those who were supposed to serve on these shiny new ships. Because that is exactly where everything started to go wrong. So, 2 brand new dreadnoughts are handed over to Brazil. The ships are magnificent. The guns are polished. Flags are raised. And now, let's descend from the deck, into the crew quarters, to those who lived and served on these ships. The officer corps of the Brazilian Navy at that time consisted almost exclusively of people with European roots. The sailors and petty officers, that was a completely different picture. Most of them came from the poorest layers of society. They were from urban slums, from villages, many with almost no education. Many from families that still remembered slavery, which had only been abolished in Brazil in 1888. Corporal punishment in the Brazilian Navy was officially banned as early as November 1889. Officially, that is the key word. In practice, the ban existed only on paper. The food was poor. On ships sailing in tropical waters, scurvy, a disease caused by a severe lack of vitamins, regularly broke out. Salaries were paid irregularly, and often not paid at all. And here is what made the situation especially explosive. A portion of the sailors ferried the new ships from Britain to Brazil. They lived side by side with British engineers and technical staff. They saw how service was organized on English ships. They returned home with a completely different understanding of how things should be. In November 1910, a sailor was subjected to corporal punishment. 250 lashes for a breach of discipline. That was the last straw. The mutiny broke out almost simultaneously on all the new ships. Several of the most hated officers were killed. The combined firepower of the mutinous ships far exceeded the strength of the rest of the Brazilian Navy. The capital, Rio de Janeiro, found itself under the guns of its own warships. Before midnight on November 22, 1910, the rebels sent a telegram to the president. The message was simple. We demand an end to corporal punishment. We are waiting for an immediate response. If there is no response, we will open fire on the city. There was no response. The rebels kept their word. Rio de Janeiro received several shells, not from the main caliber guns, but that was enough to make the authorities waver. Corporal punishment was officially abolished. The rebels were granted amnesty. The mutiny, which went down in history as the Revolt of the Lash, formally ended. However, the promises made were only partially fulfilled. Many of those who were amnestied were dismissed and sent home. To maintain the ship's technical condition, they had to temporarily hire civilian sailors from Portuguese vessels. On December 9th of that same year, the crew of the ship Rio Grande do Sul, the only major new ship that did not participate in the mutiny, staged a rebellion. The rebels didn't gather enough strength and failed. Following that, a battalion of Marines at the Ilha das Cobras naval base mutinied. This uprising was also suppressed. A racket broke out in the Brazilian parliament. Presidential candidate Rui Barbosa made a loud speech with content roughly like this: "Why do we even need these huge warships that pose such a threat to our own state? Historically, Brazil has always fought on rivers. Wouldn't it be more reasonable to spend the money on a river fleet?" The argument was met with applause. All of this together, the mutinies, political debates, and general nervousness, led to the suspension of the construction of the third dreadnought, the Rio de Janeiro. And then, the question of canceling the contract arose entirely. It would seem like a local political crisis, a naval squabble in a distant South American country. But it was at this moment that a man entered the story who is usually not remembered in the context of battleships. He was not an admiral or a politician. He was a botanist. And what he did 30 years earlier with a basket of orchids was now catching up to Brazil with the inevitability of a tide. The year 1876. British naturalist Henry Wickham is living in Brazil, studying local flora. A passionate, not-so-wealthy man known in narrow scientific circles. And one day, he receives an offer. The essence of the offer is this: to remove a batch of rubber tree seeds, Hevea, from Brazil, for a generous reward. The British government, of course, is officially uninvolved, and if something goes wrong, no one will help Wickham. Why was this so important? Because Brazil held a global monopoly on rubber production, and it guarded it seriously. An attempt to take Hevea seeds out of the country was punishable by death. Wickham thought about it. Then he agreed. And he developed a plan that can only be called elegant. Over several months, he regularly sent batches of orchid seedlings on steamers, in baskets with soil. Every time they were inspected by customs, he would start a scandal. He would say the customs officers were crushing his orchids, damaging the fragile plants, ruining his scientific work. He demanded careful handling. He was indignant. He wrote complaints. He did it time and time again, over and over. Eventually, the customs officers just got tired of dealing with him. Wickham's orchid baskets stopped being inspected altogether. And that was his moment. He left with the next batch of orchids himself. In those same baskets, under those same orchids, lay tens of thousands of Hevea seeds, collected by him personally in the Amazonian jungle. Customs didn't stop him. In London, a check for £10,000 sterling awaited him, a huge amount of money for those times. He later received a knighthood. He lived to a ripe old age in comfort. 70,000 seeds sprouted. The saplings were taken to Ceylon. The trees took root. They began to reproduce. Gradually, the Hevea spread to British plantations in many tropical countries in Asia. By the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil had competitors, serious ones. Asian rubber turned out to be cheaper. The Brazilian monopoly, which the country guarded under threat of death, collapsed. One man with a basket of orchids did what no competitor managed to do in decades. But that was only the beginning of the trouble. In 1906, a coffee overproduction crisis erupted. World prices fell to 16 cents per kilogram. This was a catastrophically low level. Brazil was forced to urgently cut back plantations. The surplus coffee, millions of bags, was burned or dumped in the sea. Literally dumped. In the ocean. Think about that for a second. A country was dumping coffee into the ocean because selling it was unprofitable. It got worse. In Europe, the Balkan Wars erupted. Financial markets were feverish. Obtaining loans from European banks became almost impossible. And the result? Brazil, which a few years ago was ready to build the best fleet in the world, suddenly found itself without money. There was nothing left to pay for the completion of the third dreadnought. In the final months of 1913, the Rio de Janeiro was simply sitting at a pier at the Armstrong shipyard in Britain's Newcastle upon Tyne. No work, no movement. The hull of the ship was gradually covered in rust and turned a dark red color. The shipyard workers called it, simply and bluntly, the rust. In October 1913, Brazil put the ship up for sale. On December 28th of the same year, a buyer was found. It turned out to be a country that no one had thought of in the context of this ship until then. A country that was called nothing less than the sick man of Europe in European diplomacy at the time, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire in 1913 was a country that had just lived through 2 Balkan Wars, and lived through them poorly. In 2 years of fighting, the empire lost almost all of its European territories. Lands that had been under the rule of Istanbul for centuries were gone in a matter of months. The army was exhausted. The treasury was almost empty. In European newspapers, the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe, and that was not just a journalistic image. It was an accurate description of the real state of affairs. But the sick man had self-respect, and it had willpower. The Turkish Naval Command understood perfectly well. To protect its shores and control the straits, a strong navy was needed, especially after what happened in the Balkan Wars, when the Greek fleet controlled the Aegean Sea without much trouble and intercepted Turkish transports. And then the Rio de Janeiro appeared, standing at the pier, covered in rust, useless to anyone. The most heavily armed ship in the world at that time, for sale. The Turks bought it on December 28, 1913. The ship received a new name, Sultan Osman I, in honor of the founder of the Ottoman dynasty. But it didn't end with one ship. At the same time, a second battleship was ordered from the same British company, Vickers, the Reshadieh. It was slightly smaller, but carried 10 343mm guns, larger and more powerful weaponry. Turkey intended to get 2 modern battleships at once. Now the question of money arose. The Turks were not rich, to put it mildly. The treasury after 2 wars was in a deplorable state. And yet, they found a way. A large state loan was taken in France. The jewelry of the deposed Sultan Abdul Hamid II was sold. Family heirlooms accumulated over generations. His personal accounts were found in foreign banks and put to work. But that was not enough. And then a national fundraising campaign was announced. Across the country, in schools, in cafes, at markets, in fishing villages, and in mountain hamlets, people brought money. Peasants set aside funds from their meager earnings. Merchants donated profits. School children handed over pocket money. Fishermen gave part of their catch. Shepherds from the interior of the country brought their last savings. Women shaved their heads and sold their hair. That was real money at the time, as hair was used for wigs and furniture stuffing. Think about this picture. The poorest people of a huge, exhausted country were giving their last. Not because they were forced to, because they believed. This ship would restore the empire's dignity. This ship would protect their shores. This ship would be theirs. All payments were made in full and strictly on time. Not a single delay. In January 1914, the future commander of the Sultan Osman I, Captain Raouf Orbe, arrived in Britain. A man with an impeccable reputation. During the Balkan Wars, he became famous for his brilliant command of the cruiser Hamidiye, which single-handedly operated against entire enemy flotillas and became a national hero. Along with Orbe, his officers arrived. Following them, by May 1914, the main crew was sent to Britain, more than 500 people. They were recruited from fishing villages and coastal towns. Some, shepherds from the interior of the country, people who had never seen a warship of this class in their lives. The British naval mission did everything possible to train them in the remaining time. In July 1914, the Sultan Osman I sailed into the North Sea for sea trials. The ship's turbines developed 40,000 horsepower. The speed on the measured mile was 22.5 knots. The result was deemed excellent. August 2nd, 1914, a date that Rauf Orbay knew by heart, was the day the ship was to officially come under the Turkish flag. On this same day, Turkey made the final payment, down to the last penny. Rauf Orbay was preparing. The flag was folded and waiting for its hour. But at the moment when the Turkish crew was rejoicing at the approaching day of the ship's transfer, in London, in the office of the First Lord of the Admiralty, something else was happening. Winston Churchill had already made a decision, and the Turks didn't know about it. The summer of 1914. Europe is rapidly sliding toward war. On June 28th, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is killed in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia begins mobilization. Germany declares war on Russia. France is next. The system of alliances that European diplomats had been building for decades begins to work like a cocked trap. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty of Britain, watches this with a cool head. He understands better than most where this is leading. And he is thinking not only of Germany. He is thinking of Turkey. Turkey at that moment is a country with strong pro-German sentiments. German advisors work in the Turkish army. Germany is actively courting Istanbul. And if a great war begins, and it will, it is unclear which side Turkey will end up on. But one thing is clear. Giving the Turks 2 modern battleships at such a moment means risking that these ships could end up against Britain. And the contracts for the construction of the ships contained a special clause. It was standard, a clause British shipbuilders included in all contracts with foreign customers. Its meaning was simple. In case of special political circumstances, the British government has the right to requisition a ship under construction, with compensation to the customer for the funds already paid. The clause was there. The motive was too. Back in June 1914, the Armstrong Company received a secret recommendation. Slow down the pace of work on the Sultan Osman I. The Vickers Company received a similar recommendation regarding the second Turkish battleship, the Rashadia. Officially, no explanations, just that the work is going a little slower. It just happens that way. The Turkish crew, having arrived in Britain, suspected nothing. Rauf Orbay and his officers lived in anticipation. August 2nd, the date of the ship's transfer. Everyone knew this date. They were preparing for it. The Turkish flag was brought from Istanbul. The ceremony was scheduled to the minute. And now, 2 events that were happening in parallel, at the same time, a few kilometers from each other. The first, the Turkish crew at the shipyard. People are cleaning their uniforms, preparing for the ceremony. They have spent months training. They know this ship. They are waiting. The second, July 31st, 1914. Churchill writes a letter to King George V. The letter is short and businesslike. It states that he has taken it upon himself to forbid the exit of the Turkish battleship, with the Prime Minister's approval. And further, a phrase that says a lot. Churchill writes that if war begins, the ship will be called, if His Majesty approves, the Agincourt. Think about it. July 31st, 2 days until August 2nd. Turkey has already made the final payment. The Turkish crew is standing a few steps from the ship, and in the royal letter, the ship is already called by an English name. Agincourt is the site of a battle in 1415, where the English army crushed the French. The name was chosen deliberately. This is not an accident or a coincidence. On August 2nd, the steamer Rashid approached the shipyard. The Turkish crew had arrived on it from Istanbul. Rauf Orbay was on the pier. The flag was ready. 8 a.m., the time of the transfer ceremony. At this moment, a British infantry company approached the ship's gangway. The soldiers boarded. The Turkish crew was invited to leave the ship. Not even invited, ordered, at bayonet point. The Turkish sailors returned to the steamer Rashid. They remained there under arrest until they were sent home to Istanbul. Without explanation, without apology, without compensation, neither then nor later. Turkey never received a single lira of the money paid. The official British justification sounded neat. Special political circumstances, requisitioning according to the terms of the contract, military necessity. Everything was by the rules. But to every person in Turkey, it looked different. People gave their last. Women sold their hair. Fishermen, their catch. Shepherds, their savings. All payments were made in full, on time, without a single delay. And in return, British bayonets on the gangway and an empty horizon where their ship should have been. For many years, Germany warned the Turkish government that Britain could not be trusted, that behind beautiful words about alliance and trade lies cold calculation. And here, a clear demonstration. An argument that required no commentary. The pro-German party in the Turkish government, which until this moment had remained one of several influential forces, became dominant. And on August 2, 1914, the very day Rauf Orbay stood on the pier with the Turkish flag in his hands, Turkey signed a secret alliance treaty with Germany. The ship, meanwhile, was hurriedly prepared for British service. And here it was discovered that something the English sailors did not expect at all. Inside this battleship, a completely different world had been built. So, the ship is requisitioned. British officers board. They look around and stop. Because what they see inside doesn't look much like a warship. Let's remember who ordered this ship and for what purpose. First, Brazil, a country with a hot climate, where people are accustomed to a certain level of space and comfort. Then, the Ottoman Empire, which wanted a representative ship worthy of a great power. Both countries paid close attention to the question of comfort when drafting the technical requirements. The result exceeded all expectations. The officer mess hall was 25.5 meters long and 18.5 meters wide. In the British Navy, such rooms simply did not exist. It was a hall that could easily fit a small restaurant. The cabins were finished with expensive wood. Turkish carpets lay on the floors. The furniture was solid, beautiful, and, which is especially important from a military point of view, completely unsuitable. Wooden furniture and carpets on a warship are a fire hazard. In battle, one shell hitting such a room turns it into a bonfire. The British immediately started cleaning. Beautiful furniture, overboard. Turkish carpets, overboard. Everything that burns and is not necessary, overboard. They also removed the boat deck, which was located above the middle turrets and interfered with their normal operation. When designing the ship under Brazilian, and then Ottoman, wishes for comfort, some watertight bulkheads inside the hull were eliminated, simply so the cabins would be more spacious. Watertight bulkheads on a ship are what keep it from sinking when holed. They were removed for the sake of the size of the cabins. British engineers shook their heads, but fixing it quickly was impossible. Now, about the main thing. About what made this ship absolutely unique. 7 main battery turrets. Not one ship in the history of naval shipbuilding, not before or after, had so many. On most battleships of that time, there were 3 or 4 turrets. On the Brazilian Dreadnoughts Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, 6. And here, 7. By British tradition, turrets on ships were designated by letters of the Latin alphabet. Here, they were officially given numerical designations, from the 1st to the 7th. But unofficially, and this caught on instantly, the turrets were named after the days of the week. Monday turret, Tuesday turret, Wednesday turret, Thursday turret, Friday turret, Saturday turret, Sunday turret, Thursday turret. It's just the name of a battleship's artillery mount, but it sounds as if it were thought up by someone with a good sense of humor. Now about those who were assigned to serve on this ship. There was no time to form a normal crew. The war had already begun. Therefore, people were recruited from different ships, from very different ones, including those who would not have been allowed on a warship in peacetime. Part of the crew consisted of people transferred from naval prisons and correctional camps. Petty offenders who were given a choice: continue serving their time or go serve on the Agincourt. Many agreed. Their sentences were cancelled, their cases were closed, and they found themselves at the guns of the most heavily armed ship of the British fleet. It sounds like the plot of an adventure novel, but it was just military necessity. And here's what's interesting. This ship, hastily assembled, with a crew gathered from everywhere, converted from a luxury palace into a combat unit, became one of the most beloved ships of the British Navy. Not for combat merit, for comfort. Those same wide corridors, spacious cabins, and high ceilings that remained even after all the modifications made the service on it completely different from a standard British battleship. The crew loved it. And the Navy wits quickly changed the official name. Agincourt is written as Agincourt in English. The witty ones turned this into Gin Palace, alluding to the oriental luxury that could still be glimpsed inside despite all the modifications. Gin Palace, with turrets named after days of the week, with a crew of prisoners and fishermen, under the British flag. This ship was ready for war, and the war awaited it. May 31st, 1916. You already know how this story opens. The North Sea, gunpowder smoke, more than 200 ships, the largest sea battle in history, the Battle of Jutland, the British Grand Fleet versus the German High Seas Fleet. Agincourt is in line, part of a British battleship squadron, a ship with turrets named after days of the week, with a crew recruited, in part, from prisons, with spacious cabins and high ceilings inherited from the Turkish order, with 7 main battery turrets that no one else had. Around 6 in the evening, the battle began, and then Agincourt did what no one expected it to do to such an extent. It fired a broadside, simultaneously from all guns, from all 14. What is a simultaneous salvo of 14 main battery guns? Let's try to imagine. A standard battleship of that time carried 8 to 10 guns. Their simultaneous salvo produced a flash and a roar that could be seen and heard for many kilometers. Now multiply that by 14 barrels. The flash was of such intensity and character that several British ships transmitted the same radio message. One of their own had just blown up. Officers grabbed binoculars, searched for debris, waited for the smoke to settle. The smoke cleared. The ship was intact. It had simply fired. It was a one-of-a-kind moment in the history of naval battles. 14 guns, 7 turrets, 1 salvo. And the observers on neighboring ships who were absolutely convinced they had witnessed the sinking of a battleship. But here is the irony. Agincourt, the most heavily armed ship in the largest sea battle in history, played a very modest role in that engagement. The actual damage inflicted on the enemy was small. The ship itself did not receive a scratch. There are several reasons. The battle was fought at long distances. Visibility was poor. Smoke, fog, dusk. Fire control at such distances was extremely difficult. And Agincourt was not the only ship whose results turned out to be much more modest than expected from such an armada. The Battle of Jutland ended without a clear winner. The German fleet lost fewer ships. The British fleet retained control of the sea. Both sides declared themselves winners. Historians are still arguing about this. Agincourt returned to port, unharmed, almost unused. After Jutland, the ship continued to serve with the Grand Fleet, went to sea, stood watch. The war ended in November 1918. In February 1922, a convention on the limitation of naval armaments was signed in Washington, D.C. The major naval powers agreed to reduce their fleets. Ships that did not fit into the new treaty norms were sent to the scrapyard. Agincourt, too big, too heavily armed, too expensive to maintain, was on that list. In the same year, it was sold for scrap. And here is a detail that is hard to forget. During its entire service in the British Navy, Agincourt became one of the most beloved ships. Not for Jutland, not for combat merit, for what it was inside. Those same wide corridors, those same spacious cabins, those same high ceilings that the Brazilians and Turks incorporated into the technical requirements by demanding comfort. British sailors, accustomed to the cramped quarters of standard battleships, having stepped onto Agincourt, couldn't believe their eyes. There was space here. You could stand up straight here. You could breathe here. When the ship was being towed to be scrapped, veterans of its crew, people who had gone through the war, seen death, accustomed to not showing feelings, wept. For several years after this, residents of coastal towns where crew members served remembered Agincourt as something more than just a ship. Monday turret, Thursday turret, Sunday turret. They went to the furnace along with the ship. 3 names, 3 flags. One story that began in the Brazilian jungles, passed through the offices of London and Istanbul, through the North Sea, and ended at the scrapyard. But before we close this story, one question, a simple one, and there is still no answer to it. What if Turkey had received its ships? The question is simple, but the longer you look at it, the deeper it goes. Let's go down the chain backward, slowly. On August 2nd, 1914, a British infantry company boarded the Sultan Osman I. The Turkish crew was escorted to the steamer Rashid. Rauf Orbay stood on the pier with a flag in his hands. And now, imagine this didn't happen, that the British company didn't come that morning, that the ceremony took place, that the Turkish flag was raised over the ship, that Rauf Orbay sailed the Sultan Osman I out of the British port and set a course for Istanbul. What would have changed? For starters, the very fact of the confiscation. It was the exact argument that the pro-German party in the Turkish government used tirelessly. Germany had told the Turks for years that Britain could not be trusted. And here, living proof. It was impossible to refute it. It was too graphic, too fresh, too personal for every Turk who gave money for this ship. Remove the confiscation, and that argument is gone. On August 2nd, 1914, the very day Rauf Orbay stood on the pier with the Turkish flag in his hands, Turkey signed a secret alliance treaty with Germany. The treaty was secret. Turkey still retained the opportunity to remain on the sidelines. It hesitated for several more months. Had it received its ships, the hesitation might have continued longer, or ended differently. Turkey entered the war on Germany's side in October 1914. This gave Germany a direct exit to the Black Sea. This cut off Russia from supplies from the Allies through the Black Sea Straits. This required Britain and France to open new fronts, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, Sinai. This tied up huge forces that might otherwise have been on the Western Front. Historians still argue about how much Turkey's participation prolonged the war. The numbers vary. But no one disputes that this participation cost hundreds of thousands of lives, on all fronts, on both sides. And all this for the sake of 2 ships, one of which began as a Brazilian order, which rusted at the pier because a botanist took out rubber tree seeds in a basket of orchids, which was bought by Turkey with money from peasant women who sold their hair, which Churchill took 2 days before the transfer. Now let's go even further back. What if, in November 1910, the sailor Marcelino Rodriguez Menezes had not received his 250 lashes? What if the person who gave that order had been stopped? There would be no mutiny. There would be no political crisis. There would be no freezing of the construction of the 3rd Dreadnought. The ship would have been completed, paid for, and would have remained Brazilian. What if Henry Wickham had declined the offer in 1876? Or if the customs officer at the pier in Brazil had looked into the orchid baskets? The Brazilian monopoly on rubber would have lasted longer. Money would have remained in the treasury. The 3rd Dreadnought would have been paid for without delays. Each link in this chain depends on chance, on one person, on one decision, on one morning. The ship lived its life under 3 names. Rio de Janeiro, the name of a city it never served. Sultan Osman I, the name under which a whole nation loved it, never having seen it under their own flag. Agincourt, the name of an English victory, under which it fought without any particular victories and was dismantled for scrap in 1922. 3 names, 1 ship, and not a single country got what it wanted. Brazil wanted to become a great naval power. The fleet it was building was torn apart by mutinies from within and economic crises from without before it could prove itself. Turkey wanted to regain its dignity after the Balkan Wars. Instead of a ship, it received humiliation, and a war on the side of the losers. Britain received the ship, used it for 10 years, then sold it for scrap. And the veterans of its crew long after that remembered the wide corridors, the spacious cabins, the high ceilings, and the Thursday turret. Remember the very beginning of our conversation? The North Sea. The evening of May 31st, 1916. A flash that was mistaken for an explosion. Officers with binoculars waiting for the smoke to settle. The smoke settled. The ship was intact. It had simply fired. 7 turrets, 14 guns, 1 salvo. And behind each of these guns, a story that didn't start in the North Sea or at a naval shipyard. It began in the Amazonian jungle, in the holds of ships with lashes, in mountain villages where women gave their hair for the dream of a great fleet. A story that this ship carried within it its entire life, under each of its 3 names. That is exactly what makes it one of a kind. Friends, thank you for your attention. Be sure to write in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most. See you in the next video.